Hello, my name is John Horgan. I'm a science writer and I also teach at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I am recording these videos with some of my colleagues at Stevens to try to tell the world who we are, and especially prospective students. And these are people who are in the College of Arts and Letters at Stevens, which encompasses the humanities, social sciences, art, and music. So today with me is one of my colleagues, Amber Benezra, who is a professor of anthropology at Stevens. And Amber, I wonder if you could start by telling us how you decided to become an anthropologist in the first place.
That's a very circuitous path. I did a master's degree in media studies and film when I first came to New York, and was a filmmaker for a long time, and then really decided that I wanted to be a social scientist. And so I became an anthropologist. I did my PhD at the New School. And I was really interested in social science research, and particularly in ethnography, which is the methodology of anthropology, which, unlike other social science disciplines, anthropologists have to go into the world and talk to people. We're forced to actually see how people live their lives on the ground, what sorts of practices people put into place. Theory is wonderful, but it's not the whole story. So that's really what drew me to anthropology. And so I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, so studying basically what makes human beings what they are in the different places in the world, all sorts of different cultural practices. And my specialty was in anthropology of science and technology studies. So I'm particularly interested in the social aspects of science, technology, and engineering, how the social and the scientific and engineering are sort of intertwined in these really inextricable ways.
So I should say that Stevens Institute of Technology, as the name implies, has a lot of engineering students, a lot of computer science students. It's got a lot of students who I think it's fair to say want to make things, want to create things, create new technologies. And it seems to me that a humanities department at a place like Stevens should take an extra interest in technology. Do you think this is happening in the humanities as a whole, that there is a more of an orientation towards science and technology?
I think absolutely so. I mean, digital humanities is a thing now, right? I think that all the disciplines across social sciences, history, even literature are all sort of moving in that direction. Science and technology studies, which is, again, my sort of core, has extended, to anthropology, sociology, geography, right? There's such a thing as human geography that really is concerned with what science and engineering and technology are doing in the world, right? And I think that's incredibly important, right? At the beginning of my career and during my postdoc, I taught a lot of liberal arts students, and those students come sort of predisposed to critical thinking. They have a lot of background in that kind of theory work. But throughout my career, I've really started orienting myself towards science and engineering students, because I realized, and from my own sort of fieldwork and research, that we have to work together interdisciplinarily to make any difference, right? And so it has sort of become my pedagogical mission now to teach engineering students and science students, really because it doesn't matter if you're a civil engineering student, a computer scientist, a biomedical engineer, you have to deal with people sometime. People will be all these things you're making, people will be at the end point of all of these things that you've made, right? So it's really important to understand what you're doing in the process and the design and the implementation. Also because gender and race and class and ableism and all of those things are sort of naturally baked into how we make things, right? And it's really important to examine those practices as we make the thing before it gets in the world.
To what extent do you think scholars at a place, humanities scholars, social science scholars at a place like Stevens should look critically at science and technology and question some of what's happened historically, and thereby get the students to think critically about some of the things that they might be doing in their careers?
That's a great question. And I think, the way that I was trained, and I think science and technology studies and anthropology, we're really taught to have this critical purview on science and engineering, how the social is always getting left out, sort of where the ethical problems arise, right? But there's sort of a limit to that sort of critical thought, because as I learned in my practice, where I collaborated with a scientific laboratory working on the human microbiome, we actually have to form collaborations, right? We have to form partnerships with those other disciplines. If we're always just sort of in this ivory tower of critical thinking, sort of gazing this self-righteous purview over those disciplines, we don't get anywhere, right? I can write tons of books for other anthropologists about microbiome science, but who cares kind of in the end, right? I want to work with scientists and engineers to help them change their practice, to help them sort of incorporate that thinking from the beginning. And so I think you're absolutely right. If we start that process with students and we start teaching students in engineering to think about their engineering critically from the beginning, they can make different choices and engineer a new kind of world, right? That's hopefully where we would get to. So I think that the humanities and social sciences can be really limited in that critical thought if you can't get out of it, right? If you always see us divided from engineering and sciences, which is why I love a more integrative approach with those disciplines.
Can you describe what you've been working on lately in terms of your research outside the classroom?
Mm-hmm. So I'm finishing a book that was based on my dissertation fieldwork and ethnography. I worked for a year and a half at the Gordon Lab at Washington University, and they're studying the human microbiome. So all of the microbes in and on our bodies that are really crucial to our health. We're really commensal organisms. They make up, more genes and more cells in our bodies than human cells and genes. So we're much more microbial than we are human biologically. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for our health and our illness on the scientific side? But what does it also mean for us as humans, sort of on the anthropological side, right? How do we need to rethink our behaviors and how we go about this world when we actually have such close relationships with these other organisms? So I worked with this lab. I was the anthropologist in the employ of the lab, sort of bringing the social science perspective to their scientific work and their experiments. And they were looking particularly at malnutrition and how gut microbes in particular affect whether kids are malnourished or not, depending on what microbial populations they have in their guts. So they were doing a lot of global health research at the time that I was in the Gordon Lab. And so I traveled to Bangladesh and did an ethnographic project there with the families who were enrolled in the scientific research. So the scientists were getting tons of fecal samples, blood samples, and looking at sort of the microbial genomics of those people, but not really seeing them as people, obviously. That's how science works, right? But I interviewed those families. I talked to them about how they felt to being enrolled in that study, what they got out of it, how many people lived in their house, what their bathroom looked like, right? What their kinship relationships were like. Because it turns out all of those sort of social intimacies really affect what microbes we have. So if you have a dog and you kiss it on the face all the time, you have much different microbes than someone who doesn't have a dog, right? If you live with someone, if you live alone, if you live in a certain part of the world, if your diet is made up mostly of plants, all those sort of social things go into making what microbes we have. So microbiome is really fascinating to me because it really combines the social and the biological in this really interesting way. So that's the work that I was doing with that lab for a long time, trying to really figure out how scientists and anthropologists can work together. we literally don't speak the same language, right? Like we don't write the same way, we don't do research the same way, we don't collect the same kind of data. So when you have two really willing parties, like how do you make it work? So that's what I've spent most of the last 10 years of my career doing, is trying to figure out those partnerships.
So I have to ask you, you're an anthropologist whose work is closely related to public health and global public health. Here we are, we're talking right now in the summer of 2020, in the middle of this ongoing, pretty unprecedented pandemic. I'm just wondering, has your scholarship, has your research, your education given you any insights into what's happening that you could share with the rest of us lay folk?
I mean, I really think that what has happened and what's really come to the fore is that social inequalities really matter in terms of health, right? That those things can't be viewed as sort of peripheral to the biological, right? Who gets sick, who gets treated, who has access to testing or medication, what your neighborhood looks like, whether or not you have to go to the drugstore or can get things delivered. All of those sort of things that are so founded in race and class and gender make a big difference about who gets sick and who gets well and who dies and who doesn't.